So this video is to do Unit 1, Module 1. These PowerPoints came with the book. They're pretty similar to the book. I've modified them slightly. The book is set up with these learning goals. Oh, we're going to talk about ecosystems in general. Most of this should be a review. These learning goals are what you should make sure that as you go through watching my video, taking notes, and adding to it when you read the book, that you can answer all of these. What these things here, explain how to define ecosystem boundaries. Explain is it like deeper goal than just define? So that's why we said explain instead of define. Make sure you understand what these terms mean and that you can answer all of these as if they were longer questions. All right, let's go through them. So the first one is explain how we define ecosystem boundaries. So since the first unit is about ecosystems, let's talk about the boundaries. Every place that's in black, these bold terms are like noted terms that you may see as like simple questions, multiple choice, things like that. Please go by what's in your book. I don't have every single term from the unit in here, so don't forget to read the book and add definitions from there. Community ecology might be a new one. It's a study of interactions among and between species. So when we're talking about an ecosystem is everything that contains the abiotic, biotic factors in that area. So we need to talk about the boundaries because that's how we know what an ecosystem is. So species are going to interact in all these ways. And when they have these interactions, those are what help define the ecosystem. So everything that is consumed in an area would be part of an ecosystem. When we have energy flow in and out that crosses the boundaries, things get a little different then. But all the species that interact in an area are in the same ecosystem. We also need to make sure we can define the abiotic and biotic factors. These are terms you should already know from biology. Abiotic is all of the non-living parts of an ecosystem, and biotic are all of the living things. So abiotic factors are things like the watershed, the edges of the boundary of the watershed, or a lake or a stream. It can also include things like maybe it's a beach where you have like the high tide down to the water line. Those are physical characteristics. Biotic factors include things like the forest itself. The forest is made of trees, which are living, so that's a biotic factor. If we're talking about, for an example, all of the bacteria that live in the gut of a fish, the fish itself is a biotic factor that helps define the ecosystem. All ecosystems, even with the ones that have boundaries, which is the boundaries themselves, there is never totally stagnant flow of energy or matter between. So all ecosystems are connected, and those are called the biosphere. Biosphere is all of the living things on the planet, which are all exist in ecosystems. All those ecosystems are connected. So this is the example from the book on defining ecosystems. We have a map here of Yellowstone National Park, a picture of a tree with a hole in it, and then the eco columns we're going to build, or something similar. So let's start at this one first. I'll make it a little bigger. This is right out of your book. So this is an example. This is a map of Yellowstone National Park, and somebody has defined this as the ecosystem boundary, which is fine. Let me trace it poorly. There's all these species that live and interact there. There's thousands and thousands more. The park itself is really small relative to the ecosystem. That's just a boundary based on like a law that made a park. The forest, which is a biotic level, is this green color. It's a little bigger. You have all this water flowing in and out, which is another abiotic factor related to the ecosystem into these lakes here. So that's an abiotic factor. And then there's private land, public land. All of this is based on all of these organisms that interact, move in and out of the park. And it's important to know these boundaries because managers make decisions about managing the species within these ecosystems and balancing the needs of the private landowners in the park and the species themselves. So ecosystems can vary in size. And this one is really big. If this is 50 kilometers across, it's a couple hundred at least, maybe 400. This is a very large ecosystem. This one is very small. So this is a tree branch, and we have like a small puddle in the knoll of the hole in a tree. It's probably just rainwater, but organisms live in there. So we have the boundary, which is the hole in the tree. The abiotic factors would be the water. The biotic factors would be the tree itself, which is the edge. But also all of these species. We have like caddisfly, dragonfly larvae here. Remember Euglena from biology and the paramecium. These things all eat and are consumed by one another. They all interact within this small area, and this is a very small ecosystem. This is an ecosystem you're going to build, or it's kind of similar to one you're going to build. It's basically a fancy terrarium. We call them eco columns because of the shape, but you'll grow some plants on the top. Eventually, not right away, you'll put an aquarium, and this can be considered a single ecosystem. We have flow of matter and energy back and forth between the terrarium part and the aquarium part. But each of these can also be considered their own separate ecosystem with separate abiotic and biotic factors. So the ecosystem boundaries can vary by size. They can vary by what species are occurring within them. They can vary by, if we want to define the species interaction to predation. There's lots of ways to define ecosystems and thus their boundaries. All right, so species competition. There's an experiment you need to know in here. So species compete. If species are overlapping for any of the same resources, habitat, food, air, water, whatever, they are going to compete. And some of those resources are going to be limiting. So there was a scientist named Gauss who grew some paramecia. We have two different species, Aurelia and this other one. We'll say Caudatum. Both species of paramecium. They live in water, they eat. So they're grown in a media that has food. So over here we have the number of individuals and time. And what happens is they form this similar, they're not identical shape. After a certain amount of time, about 10 days, the species grows first in terms of population, and then it becomes stable, and it's maintained at that. And this is pretty high. A lot of species, a lot of individuals there. This paramecium much bigger. It's probably not surprising that their population increases faster, but then it becomes stable, stagnant growth at a lower amount. Now, these species do not naturally occur together, but Gauss wanted to see what would happen if you put them in the same culture, in the same growing medium. And you can see the Aurelia in this yellow color and the Caudatum in this green. They competed. So they started out, growth was kind of similar initially, but then the resource was limited. He wasn't constantly adding food. So what happened is the Aurelia outcompeted the Caudatum at growth. It didn't grow as high as it did over here, but it was still a successful species. Its population grew, became stable. The Caudatum could not compete. It tried to, but its population decreased after a few days and bottomed out, and it went, quote unquote, extinct, at least in that area. So this gives rise to an idea that we call the competitive exclusion principle. It's that two species competing for the same resource cannot coexist. They will either change behavior, they will change their body, or they will die. So that is one of the sort of compelling ideas around ecosystems and species that compete. So the species evolve or adapt to avoid competition. So the most classic example of this is the Galapagos finches that Darwin saw back in the day. He realized there were, even though these are very small islands and these animals were very similar morphologically, there were 4 separate species. The vegetarian finch, based on its name, only eats plant matter, plant buds. The woodpecker finch only eats insects. And these two, which look the most alike, are the large ground finch and the small ground finch. And the idea is that at some point they were competing. So what happened was there was species 1, which was the small ground finch. And its individuals, this is the number of individuals. Most of them ate some seeds that were between medium and small. Some of them ate really little ones, still less. But a substantial number of them ate seeds in this size range. Okay, who cares? Initially, when these species were competing, the large ground finch, most of their species ate this medium-large size, but a subset of them competed for the same size seeds as the small ground finch. This would put them in direct competition, and one's going to win. And so what ends up happening is the ones here could not compete with the small ones, and they either changed their morphology or died off. And what we see happen was they ended up with a much larger bill. The population size used to eat this sort of middling size, but you can see on average over time they've changed their behavior due to morphology to eating larger seeds. And when they do that, that means that they don't have to compete as much with the small ground finch. And one species doing this, species will change behavior, morphology, through evolution, and that's resource partitioning. They have split up how they are going to share resources, not consciously, through their changes in due to evolution to avoid competition. Make sure you take a look at this graph and you can explain it. Resource partitioning happens with a lot of species, but the finch is the cleanest one. Okay, so next goal. Species interactions involves one species consuming another species. These should mostly be review. Some of them might be new. You learned first consumer, secondary consumer, predation, herbivory, and bio, but I'm going to go over them again. Predation is pretty straightforward. One animal eats another. The book uses the example of wolves, moose. That's fine, whatever. This is one that kids sometimes get confused by. This is the term parasitoid. It sounds like parasitism. A parasitoid is a specific type of predation where instead of just going out and hunting an animal, a parasitoid lays its eggs. There's famous wasps that do this, beetles. They lay their eggs inside another organism. It hatches, and then the larvae consume from the inside. It's kind of awful, but it's a type of predation that a lot of kids mess up. Parasitic wasps are the example of that. Keep in mind that predation drives evolution as well. Prey evolve to avoid predation. There's a bunch of different ways organisms will evolve to avoid predation. Sometimes they camouflage themselves. If you think about some of the fish on the coral reefs, they do this. Other organisms will grow spines, like a sea urchin, to avoid being eaten. Some things do mimicry. They'll look like butterflies, or organisms that frequently have very bright colors are mimicking poisonous ones, which brings us to the last one, chemical defenses. Some organisms just become toxic to eat, poisonous. And so mimicry just capitalized on that. But you need to know some of the ways that prey evolve to avoid predation. There's a couple other species interactions. We have parasitism. That one you probably know. An organism lives on another organism on a small scale. These are the things that you may have learned already in biology, like worms and flukes and the parasites, platyhelminthes, you may remember. Herbivory is the consumption of plants by animals. Pretty straightforward, grazing, things of that nature. You've seen cows, deer, whatever do it. Overconsumption by grazers can cause ecosystem collapse. The book talks a little bit about deer over-consuming due to their population explosion. There's a really classic example in marine science with sea urchins. So on the west coast of the United States, sea urchins had a population explosion in kelp forests because their primary predator is sea otters. Sea otters were hunted nearly to extinction for their fur. So their response was these sea urchins had absolutely enormous population explosion. Sea urchins eat the holdfast, the bottom of the large kelp. And so what would happen is there were these growth of the sea urchin population. They were grazing. They ripped up the holdfast as part of their grazing behavior, and the kelp forest almost collapsed. So that's an example of overconsumption from grazers or herbivory leading to the collapse of the ecosystem. So this table here is really important. This should be review from bio, but if you don't remember, please take a few minutes to make sure you really internalize it. Make sure you can give an example of both, talk about which is negative, which is positive, which is neutral. I'm going to go through this quickly, but it is in the book and it should be a review. Mutualism is the most classic example. It's where species interact and it's positive for both. The most classic example you're always going to see is plants and pollinators, birds, bats, so on. In the marine environment, we're talking about coral reefs and the zooxanthellae, the algae that live inside them. Corals are benefit because they have sugar from photosynthesis, and the zooxanthellae live someplace where they're protected from being eaten by whatever. Commensalism is one where one species benefit and the other is neutral. The example would be a coral reef with the fish and the coral. The fish benefit because they have a place to hide. They have a place to graze. They have protection from predation, and the fish don't negatively impact the coral. Most of the fish. Some do, obviously, but there are some that are just neutral. Make sure that you can, we did predation, herbivory, mutualism, commensalism. All right, they're all there. So we've covered all of these. Last one, and this is only one page. These terms you've probably used before. For some of you who are in the research classes, this is really important in terms of your projects. Some of you are related to this. Native species is a term you need to understand. Native species evolve with their ecosystem over time. They've developed a niche and they're specific to that area. Compare that to exotic, alien, non-native species. So native species are things like in our forest, oak trees, hickory trees, things that are naturally found there. Exotic alien species often get a lot of press, but these are three different ones, though there's overlap, particularly between this, but also sometimes this, which is rare. So let's talk about it. Exotic species are species that have not evolved to that specific environment. They're usually brought over by human activity. There's some really famous examples: the spotted lanternfly. Um, they came here. They're now invasive. Um, some have just been moved to human activity and don't cause problems. Non-native species do not inherently cause problems. That's the difference between them and an invasive species. So like honeybees, not native to this area. Red foxes, not native to this area. Cats, dogs, things like that, not native to this area. And they've all been brought here by human activity. Those that are non-native, they come here and they spread quickly, can also be termed invasive. So invasive species are species that suddenly spread quickly and cause harm to the native environment. They're usually exotic. The classic examples are kudzu, which is a plant. You should look up pictures of it. It basically ate the South. It's from Asia, as most of our invasive species are, and it's spreading at like huge rates. It's knocking down buildings. Is how big kudzu, how big a problem kudzu can be. Lanternflies, stink bugs. Those are all examples of exotic invasive species. There are some very rare examples of native invasive species, and the classic one in this area is Phragmites or elephant grass. There's a bunch of it here. That's why I included it in this picture. We have it all over Sandy Hook. It is a native species. Phragmites australis, despite the name, is native. We actually know what happened to it. It underwent a genetic mutation, and it suddenly began to grow and spread everywhere. It is dominating brackish and marsh systems. It spreads quickly and causes problems, but it is an example of a native invasive. Rare, but they do exist. All right, so we've finished Module 1. Make sure you take good notes, and we'll go over any questions you have in